Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today in my session, and I hope everyone is keeping safe and healthy these days. My name is Shayani Weeresinghe. I'm an environmental scientist by profession, and I'm currently working as the delivery manager for environmental social governance research at Acuity Knowledge Partners. My views today are my personal views and are not affiliated with the company in any way. And yeah, let's get right into it. So today I'll be talking about what we can see is the environmental impact when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. Something that everybody has really seen. There's been a tangible difference because obviously there are less people now on the roads. Transport is massively affected. People are not going into work these days. Everybody has been more or less asked to stay at home and work from home. And there's been a tremendous difference. So how do we really see this translating when it comes to environmental impacts and climate impacts as well? So I'd really like to kind of dissect that, and we'll start off and see what really has been the environmental impacts when it comes to COVID-19. So firstly, everybody is very interested, obviously, in what does this mean when it comes to climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions is critical, and obviously greenhouse gas emissions has been the driver when it comes to climate change impacts. Greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, whether it's your vehicle emissions, factory emissions, this is really what has been driving climate change. And we've seen that with two countries, actually, China and Italy, where it has been significant, the number of cases as well, is places where there's been actually very high air pollution. And there's been very interesting studies that have been done where you see satellite images over China and Italy. And there's been a tremendous difference where it's basically completely cleaned up. There is no toxic emissions. Nitrous dioxide is basically how you monitor these emissions when it comes to air pollution. And there's been a drastic cut because there is no more people on the streets, there are no more vehicles, there are no more factories functioning in these countries due to the quarantine. And this is one of the tangible impacts we've seen. But let's get back also into some of the root causes, right? What does it really mean when it comes to COVID-19? How was it initiated? So we know it's a zoonotic disease, which is basically where it has come from the transmission from an animal to a human. And what does that mean? So we have also seen there are certain drivers when it comes to environmental issues that has caused this to happen in the first place. So one fundamentally, which is why this happened in the first place, is basically illegal wildlife trade. When it comes to illegal wildlife trade, the illegal consumption of these meats through illegal, the trafficking across borders is something that has fundamentally become more commonplace in countries, and it's also where we have come into contact with this increasing presence of zoonotic diseases. So this has been also fundamentally been driven because there have been issues like deforestation. So people are coming increasingly more into contact with wildlife, and the human-animal conflict is increasing globally, where you have this encroachment into their ecosystems. So how do we really monitor that, and how do we ensure that we reduce this increasing contact with wildlife and ensure that we actually effectively control when it comes to trade and trafficking? Other drivers that we kind of see as well is obviously that it comes with intensified agriculture and livestock production as well, which is also going hand in hand with land use change. So this is why you have people interacting more with wildlife trafficking as well, and because of food scarcity. Because food scarcity causes us to actually encroach into these ecosystems, causes us to cultivate more, basically have more livestock. And this is also something that you see in Sri Lanka fundamentally. So it basically all goes hand in hand. So although we are seeing very much so positive impacts, like I said initially, that you have basically the reduction of emissions, we also need to have a very clear understanding what the root causes were for this to arise in the first place. So although there has been certain calls for bans when it comes to illegal wildlife trade and trafficking, it's also driven by these factors, because people are fundamentally driven by obviously hunger and the need to sustain their livelihoods. So we need to tackle these root causes in the first place to ensure our interaction with these sort of diseases also reduce when it comes to the future. So that's sort of the introduction I wanted to get into when we first came to what is actually the environmental impact of COVID-19. And also what I would like to discuss is that something that I think a lot of us also weren't aware, and I certainly wasn't also very familiar with, was that actually 75% of new and infectious diseases is zoonotic diseases, which is where it is transmitted from animals to humans. So this is not an issue that is going to go away in the future. It is going to be increasingly more common, and it has to do very much so with our lifestyle and our consumption habits. And we have to be extremely aware of how we consume when it comes to basically our meats and our lifestyle when it comes to shopping, and what is the actual supply chain for the food to reach our tables from the farm, right? So that farm to table concept is increasingly becoming more apparent to us, that we need to understand the dangers and the entire supply chain, where they originate from, where these food resources originate from, and why it's important to be aware of the long-term health impacts and how it can cascade not into a local level, but when it comes to sort of global supply chains as well. So starting off with that, I just wanted to set the context when it comes to COVID-19, but also go into the fact that yes, it has been good news so far when it comes to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And this has been extremely important, like I said, when it comes to air pollution. And in fact, with China basically shutting down its operations, it has been said that it has avoided over 4,000 lives, right? 4,000 lives of children under the age of 5 years. So that is something that is basically an annual figure that happens when it comes to deaths related to air pollution. And it's striking that this is something that we're not really aware of, right? Because air pollution is something that is not an accident or some sort of very sudden occurrence where you are very aware of it, whether it's, getting some sort of fatal disease, but it's something very chronic, because it's your chronic exposure to long-term bad air quality. And it has a very high figure of fatality basically on an annual basis. So a figure that came out through the WHO was that actually 4,000 lives of children under the age of 5 years was avoided this year in China. And when it comes to adults over the age of 70 years, 73,000 lives have been avoided. So these are very high figures, and figures that we would never really be in touch with, because we are not aware of the chronic and long-term exposure when it comes to these sort of issues like air pollution. And I think that's also something that we will become more and more aware when it comes to the future. And we see much more tangible climate change impacts, even though it's already increasing contemporarily, but we will see this increase much, much more in the future. So moving on, I'd like to go into also the measures that businesses can really take when it comes to being sustainable in the future. There's a lot. So in this second section, I want to sort of outline where businesses can choose to be more sustainable and take some good practices away from this pandemic It has allowed us to really stop and take stock of what is happening in the world and better prepare ourselves once we finally come out of it. So these are some of the ideas that I have from an environmental perspective. So basically, it would be fundamental, right? Even if you're looking at becoming a startup after this pandemic, basically, when it comes to your business plan, at a very basic level, no matter how small the company is or the startup that you're looking at, it will become fundamental to look at your supply chain, right? You have to be able to map out your supply chain, have a very good idea of what the resources you're utilizing, constantly assess those, and have an idea of the volatility. So I'll give you a very simple example. Say you're just trying to do like a grocery delivery, which we've seen a spike of in Sri Lanka, and you're trying to look at, selling vegetables and so forth. So you have to have an idea what the vegetable economic center that you're going to be utilizing, who the traders are. Say it's, you're looking at tomatoes or potatoes, have an idea what the crop seasonality is. You should be very aware of what the seasonality is so that you know what the volatility will be. And that way you can have a very reliable supply chain. This is essential, I would say, because I think in Sri Lanka also we have this understanding that normally, like if you go to one of these very small sellers, they'll say like one day there's potato, one day there isn't, but they don't really have a good understanding why that is the case, and they're not able to plan accordingly. And there have been a lot of different examples. For instance, the overabundance of pumpkins last year. Farmers were having to throw these away. They were not able to understand what they should do to really get it sold. The people had to come up with more innovative ways of actually getting rid of their produce, right? So this is the case also when it comes to basically supply chain mapping and resilience. So how do we ensure that, right? So in that perspective, these sort of grocery deliveries can do that. And also we need to have an idea that obviously if we are going to now move away from this concept of global supply chains, because that is essentially the crux of this issue, right? Most of manufacturing companies had entirely dependent on China to give very cheap reliable products. And this is the case also in Sri Lanka, where you're facing basically shortages, whether it's in the apparel industry or even in marketplaces like PETA, able to get the regular products that they would normally get from China. And they just don't have a backup resource. So we will have to move to basically localization. So what does that mean when it comes to localization? It's ensuring that you also continue to maintain quality standards, right? And that's fundamental, especially if you're in a manufacturing industry, to ensure quality of standards are met. And at the same time, also the price sensitivity point. These products will have to be cheap, especially when we come out of this situation that we are in. There will be it will be critical, the price point, right? You want to be able to get an affordable product, but at the same time something that you can sell on for a reasonable price, right? So that is essential when it comes to more sort of mass manufacturing industries, but maybe not so much in the niche. So again, when it comes to your business planning, are you going to look for something more niche, or are you going to look at more at a mass scale? So all of that is crucial when it comes to understanding your supply chain and ensuring that you've mapped out your resources and that your resources are sustainable for it to run. Simple examples, whether it's like a beverage company, say you're producing beverages, you have to have an idea of what the lifeline of your water resource is. And like I said, if it's just even a grocery startup, have an idea of what is actually the volatility when it comes to the available produce. And that way you will be able to sustain yourself in the long term. And this really ties into basically your business continuity planning. So I think that it will give a rise to business continuity planning. It's not something for basically for the corporates anymore. It's something that any SME, any startup will have to have a basic business continuity plan. It will be fundamental, especially in a country like Sri Lanka, where we're exposed to multiple hazards, multiple natural hazards, right? Hazards is basically before you have a disaster. Hazards can be whether it's, increased rain leading to flooding or increased temperatures leading to drought situations, right? So Sri Lanka is exposed to multiples of hazards. Because we're an island nation, we have several natural hazards that we are faced with. So it will become fundamental to have a very basic business continuity plan. No matter the scale of operations, number of employees, it will be fundamental to know what your BCP will be in the future. So going back to this concept of shifting from globalization to localization, right? It will be fundamental to also look at basically the behavioral shifts of the consumer, right? All services now are essentially going to be geared towards essential services. We will see that because one is also coming after this pandemic. There will be very scarce resources. People will be sort of less prone to spend. So, in that perspective, all services will cater to the consumer. Any sort of non essential services where it's not directly tied up with the consumer, I think will more or less sort of fade away. Um, and that's something that is essential to ensure that you are constantly tied in with behavioral shifts and are very, very well aware of where the consumer is moving towards. I mean, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was these trends where people were becoming more health conscious, more socially responsible. But we will see now this heightened sense of basically being more health conscious, right? Because following this pandemic, people will have a sense of, sanitation, hygiene practices, because there will be a continued way of life, right? This will be a new normal for us where we will have to restrict our movement, we will have to practice better hygiene, we will have to continue to work in this sort of space where we have to be very mindful of how we associate with other people, and there will be less interaction. So that also kind of ties into the mentality as well of the consumer. So I think that will be sort of basically this rise when it comes to the value proposition of hygiene practices, being more health conscious, and obviously the environmental footprint as well of these products. And people will overall become very much more socially responsible in that perspective when it comes to buying certain products, right? But also the rise of the digital, right? Digital channels, as we've already seen, everybody has moved to digital channels now because it has been extremely important that we look at moving to these sort of platforms since we have to be contactless. And I think this will also continue into the future where there will be a need to remain more contactless. And for instance, working from home along those lines, there will be a continued presence to do whether it's online banking or grocery shopping, a need for these platforms, which we've seen a spike for, but also ensuring the accessibility point, right? Because this is very much more for sort of middle class where people are more online, more tech savvy. But how do we ensure that we reach the grassroots? This will need to be cascaded into SMS services, ensuring platforms are trilingual so people are able to access it. Because the presence factor is not only what is key, but the accessibility point. So, language, ensuring that we cater obviously people who are differently abled as well. These are things that are challenges, but will nonetheless need to be considered in the future. So, along those lines, I think those are really the main sort of measures that we can kind of see that will take root following the COVID-19 pandemic, and us to have a increased understanding that we are going to have to look at a sort of a new normal in our lifestyle and how we approach basically our working and our livelihoods as well. And this is where we can really sort of ensure that we take advantage of this time that has been given to us. I think it's truly time that has been given to us to reassess and ensure that we stabilize the economy and go for planned degrowth. That is what is really required from an environmental perspective, because there's been such a high consumption when it comes to resources, and people have really gone into a very frenzied buying sort of mentality where people have been driven by materialism. And it's very important that we take this time to now sort of regroup and understand what the new normal will be. And we are kind of forced into that nonetheless, because following this, it will be fundamental sort of the price sensitivity. People will no longer be sort of buying non-essential items, and will have to plan their livelihoods around that. So we really need to take root of that, and companies also, and businesses and SMEs as a whole will have to sort of now reframe themselves along this new normal. And finally, moving on, I just wanted to give also a little bit of context on what's sort of other disasters that could happen in the future. That was something that was also asked. Is there anything similar that we could see? Everybody is already thinking about basically the economic decline that could come as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But following that, it's really climate change as well. I mean, climate change is something that is chronic and is something that we already live with. But there's a lot of different events that could happen in the future as well, and the increasing magnitude and frequency of these events. For instance, in West Africa right now, there's been a locust swarm for about 3 months that has decimated all crops, and this is something that used to be a very infrequent occurrence, right? But now is happening more frequently and at a much larger scale. So how do we prepare ourselves for these sort of more freak or extreme events in the future when it comes to climate change? This is why it's critical, like I said, to have a awareness when it comes to your business continuity planning. But also, these are some things that also we might not be able to map out completely, right? Just in some of my research when I was looking through to see what sort of different occurrences that can happen when it comes to climate change, there's also an understanding that this is not something completely new. Obviously, there has been several pandemics in the past, but with climate change, there's another link as well, because, for instance, you'll have viruses that have been contained by permafrost. So permafrost is basically a frozen layer of soil. So, for instance, in the Arctic, there have been instances when it came to certain viruses. I think it was basically the Spanish, was it the Spanish flu? Oh, no, it was actually the anthrax. So in 2016, there was a extreme incident that happened where a 12-year-old boy had died from anthrax in the Arctic Circle. And how it occurred was basically the frozen carcass of a reindeer which had been exposed to anthrax previously, had thawed out due to a heat wave in 2016. So these are sort of, extreme events that we would have never thought of or planned, but are happening now because of climate change, right? And in that same line of thinking, there are plenty of other different sort of global systems that are there. For instance, whether it's regional circulation of warm water currents, where these temperatures are maintained, and basically regional oceanic levels. There are different global systems, different sort of unusual circumstances which are being very carefully managed when it comes to climatic factors. But what happens with climate change is it throws these factors off, right? You have an increase in temperature. So that's what happened here, right? Where you had a sudden increase in temperature, and then basically the permafrost melted, and then anthrax was exposed. And unfortunately, it led to a fatality of a 12-year-old boy, and basically also about 20 plus individuals had contracted it. But that was in the Arctic Circle, right, where the human density of the population is very low. So imagine if these sort of instances happen in a much more dense population, right, in Sri Lanka or any other country where basically the contraction of the disease would move at a much faster pace. So these are the issues that we can't really map out, right? These are unforeseen factors when it comes to climate change. And that's why it's critical for us to ensure that we do our best when it comes to sort of our consumption habits, our lifestyle, that we also continue to do our part to ensure that we don't give these sort of cascading factors when it comes to climate change, and very simple things. Um, Having a better understanding of basically our consumption, buying more local, being more sustainable in how we shop, how we consume things, and it will become a fundamental way of life, as we can see also. So I really wanted to sort of discuss that these are the sort of different aspects that can come up with climate change. And along that lines, there are different disasters that could happen. We could see increasing scarcity of water. We could see increasing scarcity of oil. The next crisis is apparently the oil crisis, and we kind of saw that already with the price wars when it came to Russia. So it is something that will happen in the future. There are possible other sort of climate related disasters that could happen, like I said, water scarcity, or when it comes to fuel. So it's very important that we do what we can, especially when it comes to food scarcity, and ensure that we practice the same principles, reduce, reuse, recycle. It's as simple as that. Shopping local, ensuring that we use minimal packaging. And these are also the practices that businesses can incorporate into their new approaches, as it will become fundamental to our lifestyle. So, on that note, I would like to end my session, and I hope it's been useful. Please do get in touch with me. Feel free to drop me a message on the chat. And if there's any questions as well to follow up, I will get back to you. And thank you so much for joining, and I hope it's been useful. So I would like to thank IYAP and especially Thiru for inviting me to this session today. And please continue to be safe and healthy. And I hope you continue maintaining social distancing. It's critical for us to flatten the curve, and we will come out of this. And I really think there is a chance for us to move into a new normal, but a new normal that would really benefit for us, not only in Sri Lanka, but globally, as long as we do our best. Thank you.